Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of dense sources and try to find the clearest path to what really matters. Today, we are getting into the deep machinery of governance. We're looking at a central irony in Parliament, this huge struggle between careful, structured thinking and the relentless momentum of the political system.
It's a fascinating topic.
It is. The sources we have explore how Parliament built this perfect tool for serious, complex, work the committee system. But its effectiveness is, well, it's often muted. So our mission today is to unpack why this essential mechanism is so often undermined. And not by incompetence, not by bad intent, but by this just overwhelming structural pressure for speed.
And that structural pressure for you, the listener, that's the key distinction here. We're looking at a problem of timing and pressure. The source material frames it as a fundamental mismatch. It's a conflict between the system's velocity and its capacity for deep reflective thought.
Exactly. So, okay, if these committees are designed for detailed thinking, to get expert evidence, to test policy, to surface risks, why does it so often feel like their work just arrives too late to matter?
Or just lands with a thud.
Right. And fails to get integrated into the final decision. All right, let's unpack this. We probably have to start by affirming that the committees themselves, they're not the problem here.
No, absolutely not. In fact, they consistently do their job really well.
They bring in the experts, they cross-examine.
And they surface these crucial risks that are not obvious in just the headline policy. They are Parliament's structural engineers, checking the foundations.
I like that analogy. And what's fascinating here is how the public conversation so often gets this wrong. The sources point out that when people complain that Parliament missed something during, say, the legislative process, they're usually talking about issues that were, in fact, meticulously raised by a committee.
Right. The system didn't miss it.
The system ignored it.
The warning was there. So the quality of the committee work is high, but the utility of that work it suffers from this timing disadvantage.
So the problem isn't the quality of the thinking, it's the pace, the inertia of the whole political machine.
Precisely. Yeah. Ideally, that rigorous examination, that structural engineering report you mentioned, it needs to happen when the policy is still fluid.
When you can actually change the design easily.
Yes, cheaply and easily.
Yeah.
But so often, the committee's work lands later, after the political commitments are already firm.
And after public expectations have already been set.
Exactly.
And that late timing, it creates an immediate and, I'd imagine, a very costly political calculation, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. I mean, think about it from the government's perspective, the executive introducing the bill. At that late stage, if a committee presents this undeniably strong scrutiny that requires big changes, acting on it means two things that look disastrous politically.
Okay, what are they?
First, you have to slow down. You risk missing your own deadlines. And second, you have to admit that your earlier certainty, your decisive action, was premature.
Which, in today's political environment, just reads as weakness, indecisiveness.
That's the core tension. And the sources note that rather than slowing down and accepting that political friction, the executive will often just receive the committee's excellent recommendations politely, thank them for their work.
And then what?
And then those recommendations are just allowed to drift.
Wow.
Yeah. Momentum, just the sheer velocity of the process, carries the policy right past the careful advice. It's a quiet but an incredibly powerful way of sidelining good work.
Without any big public confrontation.
Exactly.
That suggests this paradox, then. The tool that was built for long-term health is being undermined by this need for short-term political fitness. But why is urgency always allowed to win? Why does it override the system's own safeguards? This is where it gets really interesting, this reign of urgency. The source details this familiar rhythm that dictates the pace. So first, a problem emerges, some crisis. Then immediate public and media pressure mounts for a swift, decisive response.
Right. Do something.
Do something now. So third, a bill is introduced really quickly to meet that demand. And boom, the legislative clock is immediately fixed, and it is running fast.
And once that clock starts ticking, all the committee's work becomes reactive. It's not proactive anymore.
They're just trying to catch up.
They're trying to catch up to a legislative vehicle that is already at top speed. Evidence is still coming in long after the timetables are set.
Yeah.
And, concerns are raised when key decisions are already half locked in by the political narrative.
Right.
So this speed trap means that the deep work testing assumptions, finding hidden risks, is constantly fighting for space in a timetable that just wasn't designed for it.
And I imagine there's very little political appetite to reopen the fundamentals of a policy that's already been branded as the solution.
Almost none.
And it's intensely self-reinforcing. It doesn't even require malice. You don't need a minister to say, ignore the committee report. It happens because, as the sources say, urgency is contagious.
That's a great way to put it.
Once speed is the priority, everything else has to negotiate for space. And in that competition between deep thought and political velocity just, it almost always wins.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the reason speed consistently wins is it's structural. The government, the executive, largely controls the parliamentary timetable. For you listening, it's so important to understand that the executive's main function is action. They decide what gets introduced and how much time the House dedicates to it.
So Parliament built this highly effective tool for slowing down and thinking carefully, but it gave the executive the keys to the throttle.
That is the perfect way to describe it. Scrutiny isn't forbidden, but it happens on a clock set somewhere else. Committees can do this incredible, careful work, but they just don't have the power to force the entire system to slow down and absorb what they've found. Their authority is intellectual, not procedural.
So this quiet mechanism, it completely flips the relationship. Scrutiny, which really should be foundational, gets demoted.
It absolutely is. The source captures this dynamic perfectly. Scrutiny becomes purely advisory, something that's nice to have, maybe useful to cite later.
But it's momentum that becomes decisive.
That's it. You have institutions designed to ask, what happens if? Well, the wider system just keeps asking, can we please move on?
And when one consistently outruns the other, the balance just tips completely away from careful examination.
Yeah.
The result is a system that looks like it can think deeply, but is structurally prevented from letting that thought become policy. This has to have a long-term cost, right? What happens when you run a system faster than its own memory?
The long-term cost is what one of the sources describes as this pattern of churn.
Churn.
Yeah, because those critical issues that committees flagged earlier were only partially addressed or were just allowed to drift. They inevitably resurface later.
Often as a bigger crisis.
Often years down the line in the form of a major crisis that needs immediate reactive attention. I mean, think of it like this. A committee report on infrastructure risk from 5 years ago was ignored because the government was focused on getting a quick bill passed. 5 years later, the predicted failure happens.
The political response is never, oh, we should have listened to that committee.
Never. The immediate reaction is a dramatic, visible move.
For
A new royal commission, a massive structural reform, a complete reorganization of an agency.
something that looks like progress. It looks like you're tearing down the old thing to build a new one.
Yes, but this constant reactive reorganization has this severe hidden cost. It just erodes and resets institutional memory. The new framework doesn't necessarily learn the lessons of the old, so the committees, meanwhile, end up relearning and redocumenting the exact same structural lessons over and over again.
Because the system just keeps moving faster than its own ability to absorb the advice it already has.
It's an exhausting and incredibly costly cycle of policy amnesia.
That's a powerful indictment. So beyond the inefficiency and the policy failures, this structure has to change the incentives for members of parliament themselves.
It absolutely does, and that's maybe the most crucial consequence for the system's long-term health.
How so?
MPs learn, and this happens through quiet observation, not, some formal memo, that deep, careful, complex scrutiny doesn't reliably travel through the system.
It doesn't guarantee policy change.
Not at all. In fact, if you're the one raising awkward, difficult questions late in the process, you're seen as a disruptor. It carries a political risk because you're messing with the momentum set by the executive.
So an MP has a choice. Spend 3 months in a room meticulously detailing a flaw that will probably be ignored, or spend 3 days publicly advocating for something more visible that might get them a soundbite on the news.
That is the behavioral feedback loop. The deepest, most necessary work is the least rewarded politically. And the sources indicate that this nudges MPs away from the difficult, detailed, often anonymous work of the committees.
And toward what?
The safest and often most effective place to intervene becomes earlier, louder, and much more visible. Back in the chamber, in a televised debate, through the media, it's a powerful structural nudge toward optics and, frankly, performance.
And the irony is just, it's truly bitter. This behavioral shift is the exact opposite of what the committee system was created to encourage.
It really is.
The whole point was to move that difficult work away from the heat and performance of the main chamber and into a reflective, evidence-based space.
But by sidelining the output of that reflective space, the system accidentally incentivizes the very performative behavior it tried to get away from.
So you create an environment where appearing to be decisive is prized far above, actually being right.
Or thinking comprehensively, yeah.
Okay, so let's wrap this all up. The fundamental issue here isn't a lack of tools or intelligence or even intent. It's a critical mismatch of momentum, the structural priority speed and decisiveness, driven by the executive's control of the timetable, invariably defeats the design priority, which is careful scrutiny. So what does this all mean for you, the listener, watching governance unfold? The result of this mismatch is that Parliament's most effective tool for complex thinking, the committee system, it kind of ends up orbiting the system.
That's a good word for it.
Orbiting. Their work is influential, it's respected, it's often the highest quality analysis available, but it's rarely decisive. They can advise, but they can't anchor the system against the pull of political speed.
And that brings us right to the tension that remains unresolved. If committees really are the place where Parliament's most rigorous thinking can happen, the necessary next conversation has to be about what structural adjustments would make their work harder to bypass. We need a way to integrate that careful scrutiny so that it genuinely stops or redirects policy momentum.
But without turning them into some kind of unelected veto.
Exactly. Without turning them into an unaccountable veto on the will of the majority government.
Mhm.
And that difficult balancing act, how you enforce deliberation without stopping democracy, that's the challenge that's still waiting to be explored.